She drove the nail into the wood so hard the hammer slipped and split her palm open. She didn't stop. Blood on the handle, blood on the beam. 8 months pregnant, alone on 40 acres of empty Montana land, and Emma Caldwell drove the next nail, and the next, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling. And feeling meant remembering the morning her husband had sat across from her in his leather chair, looked at her swollen belly, and said, with the calm of a man announcing a minor scheduling change, "I've arranged for you to stay with my cousin in St. Louis until this is dealt with. Not, are you all right? Not, what do you need? Not even, I'm sorry, this is dealt with." She had set down her coffee cup, walked upstairs, packed one bag, taken the deed she had filed in secret 3 weeks before, and walked out the front door of the finest house in Denver without looking back once. And now she was here, bleeding, building alone. The town of Red Hollow watched and whispered and waited for her to break. She never did. But what happened next, what that woman built with nothing but her hands and her will on 40 acres of forgotten Montana land, was something nobody in Red Hollow, nobody in Denver, and certainly not her husband, ever saw coming. If you have ever been told you were too much and not enough at the same time, stay with me. This story is for you. Subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Emma Caldwell's story travels, because it deserves to go everywhere. Now let me take you back to the summer of 1886 and show you the woman nobody believed in. The wagon that brought Emma Caldwell to Red Hollow, Montana, stopped at the edge of a dirt road that didn't have a name. The driver, a weathered man named Carl, who had hauled freight across 3 territories, climbed down and unloaded her single suitcase, a canvas roll of tools, and a crate of dried provisions without a word. He had agreed to take her this far, no farther. "This the place?" he asked, not really looking at her. "This is the place," Emma said. Carl glanced at the open land, 40 acres of dry grass, a creek line visibly in the nothing standing on it but wind and silence. Then he looked at her belly, round and low and heavy under her plain wool dress. His mouth opened, like he was going to say something. Emma met his eyes. He closed his mouth, climbed back onto the wagon, and drove away without another word. She stood there for a long time after the sound of hooves faded. The land was hers. She had the deed in her bag, signed and filed in the county courthouse 2 weeks ago, purchased with every dollar she had managed to pull out of the household accounts before Charles realized what she was doing. 40 acres of forgotten territory that nobody had wanted to file on because the nearest town was 4 miles out and the soil looked poor to anyone who hadn't read the agricultural survey the way Emma had. She had spent 3 months in the Denver City Library reading everything she could find about Montana land, about construction, about water tables and crop rotation and timber sourcing, before she ever signed that paper. Charles had thought she was going to the library to read novels. He had never once asked what she was reading. She pulled her suitcase toward the one flat stretch of ground near the creek, set it down, and looked at the sky. It was wide and blue and completely indifferent to her. The grass moved in long waves. A hawk turned in a slow circle overhead. "All right," Emma said quietly, to no one and to herself and to the child pressing against her ribs. "Let's get to work." She built her first shelter that afternoon, not a cabin. Not yet. Just a canvas lean-to-stretched between 2 young cottonwood trees, with a bedroll inside and her tools laid out in a row on a flat piece of board. She worked slowly and carefully, because she had learned that, pregnant or not, careful work didn't cost you extra time the way mistakes did. Her back ached with a steady, grinding persistence she had grown used to ignoring. Her ankles had started swelling 2 weeks ago. She soaked them in the creek each evening and wrapped them tight each morning. She had made a list of what needed doing, in order of importance, and she worked the list. That was what Emma Caldwell did. She made a list. She worked the list. She did not allow herself to think about everything that had brought her here. Not yet. Not while there was still light and lumber to be measured. The lumber had been delivered 2 days before she arrived. She'd arranged it by letter, paid in advance from Denver, had it stacked on the property by a supplier out of Billings. 40-foot pine logs for the frame, milled planks for the walls, roofing material wrapped in oilcloth. She had been specific about every dimension. Charles used to laugh at the way she planned things, the way she wrote everything down, organized every household account down to the last penny. He hadn't laughed when he'd looked at the household ledger the morning after she left. She knew because his lawyer had sent a letter. She had not written back. The first week was the hardest physical labor Emma had ever endured in her life, and she had grown up on a farm in Indiana, where hard labor was simply what life looked like. She was not a delicate woman. She was not a woman who had been coddled. But she was 8 months pregnant, alone, and lifting beams that required 2 strong men on a normal day. She solved this problem the way she solved every problem. She thought about it carefully, and then she built a system. She rigged a simple block and tackle from the cottonwood trees, using rope she'd purchased specifically for this purpose. She could not muscle a 12-foot beam into position by raw strength, but she could lever it, inch by inch, using physics and patience. It took her 3 times as long as it would have taken a crew. It did not matter how long it took. What mattered was that it got done. On the 5th morning, she heard horses on the road. She was up on a temporary platform she'd built, checking the level on the first wall frame, when she heard them 2 riders, moving at a slow walk. She kept working. People rode past land all the time. It didn't mean anything, but the horses stopped. She heard one rider dismount. "Ma'am." The voice was careful, not rude but uncertain. "You all right up there?" Emma looked down. The man standing at the edge of her property was somewhere in his mid-30s, lean and broad-shouldered, with the kind of tan that came from years outdoors rather than a season of it. He wore a good hat and good boots, not showy, but quality. His horse was a gray quarter horse that stood perfectly still. Behind him, a younger man, probably a ranch hand, stayed mounted and said nothing. "I'm level," Emma said. "Thank you." The man, she didn't know his name yet, didn't move. He was looking at her rig, at the block and tackle, at the wall frame she'd raised. Something shifted in his expression. Not pity. She was so tired of pity that she'd started recognizing it the way you recognized a particular smell. This wasn't pity. "That's a smart rig," he said. Emma looked at him steadily. "It works." "Yes, ma'am, does." He turned his hat in his hands once, then settled it back on his head. "Nathaniel Brooks. I run the Brooks Ranch, about 3 miles east of here." "Emma Caldwell," she said. "I own this, ma'am." "I know." County records. He paused. "You planning to build alone?" "I'm building alone right now," she said. "So I reckon that answers your question." Something crossed his face, not offense, but something closer to respect, though she wasn't ready to trust that impression yet. Men offered expressions like respect the way they offered a handshake automatically, without much intention behind it. "My father asked me to ride out," Nathaniel said. He heard a woman had purchased the Halloran parcel and thought. He stopped. Started again. "He thought you might not be aware of the drainage issue on the eastern quarter." Emma climbed down from her platform slowly, one careful rung at a time, and when she reached the ground she walked to where he stood and looked him in the eye. "I'm aware of the drainage issue," she said. "The eastern quarter runs wet in spring, which is why I'm planting root crops and keeping the cabin site on the western rise. The survey from 1879 was very clear about the water table." Nathaniel Brooks looked at her for a long moment. "You read the 1879 survey," he said. "I read everything," Emma said. He was quiet. Then he said, "My father also wondered if you might consider selling." There it was. Emma had been waiting for this. She'd been waiting for it since the day she filed the deed. She'd been waiting for it since Denver, since before Denver, since the morning she sat across from Charles in his study and watched him lay out his plans for her life as if she were a piece of furniture he was deciding where to put. Your father can come ask me himself, Emma said, if he wants an answer that means anything. Nathaniel's mouth curved slightly at one corner. It wasn't quite a smile. It was something more private than that. Yes, ma'am, he said. He stepped back, put his hat back on. Good luck with the frame, Miss Caldwell. Mrs., she said. He looked at her left hand, which was bare. She'd left the ring in Denver on the fireplace mantel, not as a statement, but because she hadn't wanted it anymore, and there was no point carrying things you didn't want. Mrs. Caldwell, he said, without any adjustment in his tone, and walked back to his horse. She watched him ride away. Then she climbed back up and kept working. The second week, Emma went into town for supplies. Red Hollow was not a large town. One main street, a general store, a feed and grain, a saloon, a church at the end of the road, and a scattering of houses behind it. She drove a rented mule cart because she hadn't purchased an animal yet, and she stopped in front of Hale's general store and climbed down carefully, taking her time, and walked in with her list in her hand. The store was not empty. It was occupied by 3 women, 2 of them wives of local ranchers, one the wife of the town preacher. Emma recognized the particular way they had of going quiet when someone walked in. She had grown up in a small town. She knew what collective judgment sounded like when it organized itself into silence. She handed her list to the boy behind the counter and waited. "You're the woman out on the Halloran parcel," said one of the women. Her name, Emma would learn later, was June Whitmore. She was in her 40s, sharp-faced, and spoke with the absolute confidence of a woman who had decided the shape of the world a long time ago and had never been seriously challenged on it. "Emma Caldwell," Emma said pleasantly. "Yes, building out there alone," June said. It wasn't quite a question. Building out there alone, Emma agreed. "In your condition," June said. Emma looked at her. "My condition hasn't slowed me down significantly." The other women exchanged glances of the specific kind that meant something had been confirmed rather than discovered. June Whitmore looked at Emma's bare left hand and then back at her face and said, very carefully, "Where is your husband, Mrs.?" "Caldwell, Denver," Emma said. "He let you come out here alone like this?" There were so many true answers to that question. Emma considered them briefly and chose the simplest one. "I didn't ask his permission," she said. The silence in the store changed quality. It went from judgment to something that was trying to decide between horror and fascination. "My supplies are ready," the boy said from behind the counter, and Emma turned and paid him and loaded her cart herself. Refusing the boy's offered hand not out of stubbornness, but because she'd calculated the weight and knew she could manage it without torquing her back the wrong way. She drove back out to her land without looking at the women standing in the doorway of the store watching her go. But she heard June Whitmore's voice carry across the distance, clear as a church bell, "She won't last a month." Emma's hands tightened on the reins. She did not turn around. 1 month, she thought. Fine. Let's see. The cabin frame was standing by the end of week 3. It was not beautiful. It was not what any professional builder would have considered polished work. But it was plumb, and it was square, and it was solid, and Emma had checked every joint and every angle twice over before moving to the next stage. The walls would go up next. She had studied the notching technique from a construction manual she'd purchased in Denver, a well-thumbed guide published in 1874 that had been written for homesteaders. And she'd practiced the notching on scrap lumber until she could do it correctly every time. Her back hurt constantly now. She slept on her left side with her knees bent, the way the midwife in Denver had told her, and she soaked her hands in the creek water before wrapping them each night, because the abrasions from the rope and the hammer handle needed to stay clean. She talked to her baby while she worked, not always in complete sentences, sometimes just a running narration of what she was doing, as if the child could hear her planning and find it soothing. "This is a load-bearing post," she would say, tamping the base. "It has to be exactly vertical. Life is easier when the foundations are exactly vertical. Remember that. On a Tuesday afternoon in the fourth week, Nathaniel Brooks came back. He came alone this time, without the ranch hand, and he stopped his horse at the edge of her property and looked at the frame standing against the sky. He looked at it for a long time, without saying anything. Emma was fitting a wall plank and did not stop working. "My father says the offer still stands," Nathaniel said finally. "My answer still stands," Emma said. "He's raised it 20%. "He can raise it 100%, Emma said. "I'm not selling." Nathaniel dismounted. He walked up to the frame and put his hand on one of the corner posts and tested it a slight push, the way a man tests the soundness of a structure. The post did not move. "Good joint," he said quietly. "Thank you." He stood there for a moment, looking at the wall she was fitting. His jaw was tight. There was something working behind his eyes that Emma couldn't quite read yet. "May I help?" he asked. She stopped. She set down her hammer and looked at him. "Help how?" she said. "That top plank," he said. "You've got it braced at one end, but you need a second hand on the other end while you nail it." He was right. She had been working around that problem for most of the afternoon, bracing and rebracing, and she hadn't gotten it fixed yet. She looked at him. She looked at the plank. "You hold the plank," she said. "I drive the nails." "Yes, ma'am. If you start making suggestions about how I should do this differently," she said, "I'll ask you to leave and not come back. I've had enough of people deciding they know better than me how to run my own life." Nathaniel held her gaze for a long moment. His expression was very still. "I won't do that," he said. "Good," Emma said. "Take the other end." They worked in near silence for the next 2 hours. He was good at following directions. He didn't offer advice. When she asked him to shift his grip, he shifted it. When she told him to hold still, he held still. He handed her nails when she reached for them without being asked, which surprised her, because she hadn't thought he was paying that close attention. When the last plank was set, and Emma stepped back to look at the wall, she felt something release in her chest, a tight knot that had been living there for weeks. "That's good work," Nathaniel said. "It is," Emma agreed. He put his hat back on and looked at her, and this time she could read his expression more clearly. It was something she hadn't seen directed at her in a very long time. He was looking at her the way a person looks at something they genuinely admire. "I'll come back tomorrow," he said, "if you'll let me." Emma was quiet for a moment. The sun was going down over the Montana hills, and the air was cooling fast the way it did here, turning from warm to crisp in the space of 20 minutes. "You can come back tomorrow," she said. "Same rules." "Same rules," he said. He rode away. Emma stood looking at her cabin wall for a long time after he left. Then she pressed one hand flat against the planking, her wall, her work, and took a slow, deep breath. She went to sleep that night in her lean-to and listened to the creek and thought about Charles. About the morning she had told him she was pregnant and watched his face go through about 6 calculations before landing on the particular expression that meant he was trying to decide what this changed. For him, not for her, not for the child, but for him. About the way he had sat down in his leather chair and looked out the window and said, "We'll have to rethink your travel situation," as if the baby were a scheduling inconvenience. She thought about the planning sessions she had not been invited to. The way he discussed her future with his lawyer, with his mother, with his business partner, all the people whose opinion mattered to him, and then presented her with the outcome as if consultation were a courtesy she didn't require. She thought about the afternoon she had sat in the Denver City Library, with her hands folded on the table, and made a decision. She was not going to let her child be born into a world where they watched their mother ask permission for everything. She was not going to let her child grow up thinking that was what women were for. She pulled the canvas of the lean-to tighter against the evening chill and pressed her hand against her belly and said softly, "We're going to be all right, little one. We're going to be more than all right." The walls went up through May. Nathaniel came 3 days a week, and then 4, and the rhythm of it became something Emma accepted with the careful sort of wariness, not suspicion of him specifically, but of herself, of the way it was beginning to feel natural. The way she had started to look for his horse on the road, without intending to. She was not a foolish woman. She knew what loneliness could do to a person's judgment. But Nathaniel was not easy to distrust. He showed up when he said he would. He left when she asked him to. He brought his own water and his own provisions, and never expected her to feed him. When she made mistakes, and she made them, because anyone who hadn't built a cabin before would make mistakes, he did not point them out in a way that felt like correction. He asked questions. What were you trying to do here? And when she explained, he would think about it and say, you could also try, and then stop and say, but you've thought about it more than I have. What's your instinct? Nobody had ever asked her about her instincts before. Not Charles, not her father, not anyone. It unsettled her more than she was ready to admit. One afternoon in early June, they were fitting the window frame Emma up on the platform, Nathaniel below handing up materials when his father rode out. She knew immediately who it was because Nathaniel went still in a way she hadn't seen before. Not rigid, still, the way an animal goes still when it scents something it needs to measure. Harlan Brooks was a big man, older, with the kind of face that had been handsome once, and had curdled slowly into something harder. He rode a black horse, and he did not bother to dismount. Nathaniel, he said. Father, Nathaniel said. Harlan Brooks looked up at Emma on her platform with an expression that had no warmth in it. Mrs. Caldwell, he said, I've raised my offer a third time. I'd like you to consider it seriously. I've considered every offer seriously, Emma said from her height on the platform. She did not climb down. My answer is the same. You're a woman alone, Harlan Brooks said, and his tone made it sound like a diagnosis. With a child coming, there are limits to what one person can manage. I appreciate your concern, Emma said pleasantly. The window frame is going in today. I'm managing fine. My son has been spending a great deal of time out here, Harlan said, and there was something in his voice now that wasn't just about the land. He looked at Nathaniel. This was not what I had in mind when I asked you to speak with her. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. No, I imagine it wasn't. What exactly is happening out here, Nathaniel? A woman is building a house, Nathaniel said clearly. And I'm helping her when she'll let me, which isn't often enough, given that she's better at it than I am. Harlan Brooks stared at his son for a long moment. We'll discuss this at home, he said. Yes, Nathaniel said. We will. Harlan turned his horse and rode away without another word to Emma. Emma came down from the platform. She looked at Nathaniel. That's going to cause trouble for you, she said. Maybe, he said. I don't want to be the cause of trouble between you and your father. You're not, Nathaniel said. This particular trouble between my father and me has been building for about 15 years. You're just the most recent occasion for it. He picked up the hammer she'd set down and held it out to her. The window frame's not going to fit itself. She took the hammer. She went back up the platform, and they kept building. By the end of June, she had 4 walls and a roof. It was not finished. There was still interior work to do, the floor to lay, the door to hang, the chimney to finish, all of it, but it was a structure. It was a shape against the sky that had not existed 2 months ago. Emma stood back and looked at it. On the evening she set the last roofing plank, with the light going gold over the hills and a warm wind moving through the grass, and felt something fill her chest that she didn't have an immediate word for. Not pride exactly, not relief, something bigger than both. Nathaniel was standing beside her. She was aware of him beside her the way you're aware of a fire in a cold room, not looking at it directly, but knowing exactly where it is. How does it feel, he asked. Emma was quiet for a moment. She pressed her hand flat against the wall. Like mine, she said. He nodded slowly. Yeah, he said, I think that's exactly right. She turned to look at him then, in the gold evening light, and she let herself see him clearly for the first time, not as a threat she was managing, not as an obligation she was navigating, but as a person. He was looking at the cabin with an expression that was not possessive, not calculating. It was the expression of a man watching something be born. She thought about Charles, who had never once looked at anything she built with that expression. She thought about what it cost to let someone see you clearly. She thought about her baby, moving and warm inside her, already learning the shape of the world through what her body told it. "Thank you," she said, "for holding the other end." Nathaniel turned to look at her. Something soft moved through his eyes. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, "I wouldn't have missed it." The wind moved through the grass. The cabin stood against the evening sky. And Emma Caldwell, who had come to this empty land with nothing but a hammer and a promise to herself, stood in front of the walls she had built and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. But the peace she had finally built was not going to hold. Because 3 states away in Denver, Charles Whitman had just received a letter from a lawyer. And he had finally started paying attention to what his wife was capable of. The letter arrived on a Thursday. Emma knew because she had been in town that morning picking up a new box of nails and a length of rope. And Carl Hess, who ran the post office, had flagged her down on her way back to the cart with an envelope in his hand, an expression on his face that was trying very hard not to be anything in particular. "Came registered," Carl said, "from Denver." Emma took it. She did not open it in the street. She put it in her coat pocket and drove back to her land, and finished loading paint and supplies into the lean-to before she sat down on a flat piece of lumber near the cabin wall and opened it. It was from a law firm, Whitman, Cray and Associates, with a Denver address she recognized because Charles had used the same firm for his business dealings for years. The letter was 4 paragraphs long and written in the careful, clean language that lawyers use when they want to say something threatening without using threatening words. The substance of it was simple. Charles Whitman was filing a petition with the Denver Family Court, claiming that Emma was unfit to raise their child alone. He cited her physical condition, her isolation, and the alleged instability of her living situation. He was requesting that the court compel her return to Denver pending a formal custody determination, and he was requesting that she cease any further disposal of assets, meaning the land she had purchased, until the matter was resolved. He was also, the letter noted, prepared to be generous. If Emma returned voluntarily, Charles would agree to a private arrangement. She would have a comfortable place to live. The child would be cared for properly. All she had to do was come home. Emma read the letter twice. Then she folded it very carefully along its original creases and put it back in the envelope. Then she sat very still for approximately 30 seconds. Then she stood up, picked up her hammer, and went back to work on the interior floor. She laid 6 planks before she allowed herself to think about it clearly, which was her method: do something physical first, something that required precision, something that would not forgive sloppiness, and then let the mind work while the hands were occupied. By the time she was fitting the 7th plank, she had thought it through enough to have a plan. She needed a lawyer, not a Denver lawyer, a Montana lawyer, someone who knew the local courts and had no connection to Charles or his firm. She needed to understand what jurisdiction applied, whether Charles could actually compel her return, or whether the petition had to be filed in Montana, where she now resided. She needed to document everything: the land deed, the construction progress, the fact that she had a roof over her head and food in her stores and a solid plan for the winter. She needed, in other words, to do what she always did. Make a list. Work the list. The trouble was that her hands were shaking slightly, which was making the nailing imprecise, and she was angry enough that she didn't entirely trust her judgment on the spacing. She set the hammer down and pressed both hands flat on the planking and breathed. The baby kicked, sharp and decisive like a punctuation mark. Emma almost laughed. "I know. We're not going back." She picked up the hammer. She kept going. Nathaniel came the next morning and she told him immediately, before he'd even dismounted, because she had decided that trying to manage the information herself was pointless. He would find out, and she'd rather he heard it from her. Charles filed a petition, she said. Custody. He's claiming I'm unfit. Nathaniel went very still on his horse. On what grounds, he said. It wasn't quite a question. Isolation. Physical condition. Instability of living situation. She crossed her arms. The fact that I don't live the way he thinks a woman in my position should live. Nathaniel dismounted slowly. He stood with the reins in his hand and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not anger exactly, but something colder and more concentrated than anger. Something that had thought in it. What are you going to do, he said. Find a lawyer in Billings, she said. Today, if I can manage it. I need to understand the jurisdictional question before anything else. Thomas Aldridge, Nathaniel said. He practices out of Billings. He's handled 3 land disputes that I know of, and he beat a saint. Louis firm on 2 of them. He's fair and he's not expensive. Emma looked at him. You know him personally? My father tried to use him once, Nathaniel said. He refused to take the case because he said my father was wrong. I've respected him ever since. She almost smiled at that. I'll write to him today, she said. Write him today and ride to Billings tomorrow, Nathaniel said. A letter takes too long. This needs a conversation. He was right. She knew he was right. She also knew that riding to Billings while 8 months pregnant, alone on a rented cart over 40 miles of unpaved road, was not a trivial undertaking. I can drive you, Nathaniel said. I don't need. Emma. It was the first time he had used her given name. They both noticed it. He adjusted slightly. Mrs. Caldwell. The road to Billings has 3 difficult creek crossings this time of year. I'm not saying you can't manage them. I'm saying you shouldn't have to manage them alone if you don't have to. She thought about it. She hated thinking about it, because the part of her that had built this cabin alone wanted to refuse every offer of help on principle. And she was beginning to understand that this was not strength, it was a kind of stubbornness that had more to do with pride than with wisdom. Fine, she said, we leave at dawn. They left at dawn. The ride to Billings took most of the day, and it was not comfortable, but Emma had stopped expecting comfort several months ago. Nathaniel drove and she sat beside him, and they talked not about Charles or the petition, not right away, but about other things. The way people do when they are traveling together, and there is distance to cover, and silence would be too pointed. He told her about the ranch, about growing up on it, about his father's particular brand of love that expressed itself almost entirely through expectation. How Harlan Brooks had built the ranch from almost nothing, and had never quite forgiven the world for not being more grateful. How Nathaniel had spent most of his adult life in trying to be the version of himself his father required, slowly coming to understand that this was a project with no finish line. He wants you to take over, Emma said. He wants me to become him, Nathaniel said. Which is different. Emma looked at the road ahead. Yes, it is. You would know something about that, he said. I would know everything about that, she said. They were quiet for a while after that. The particular quiet of 2 people who have just recognized something in each other and are not yet sure what to do with the recognition. Thomas Aldridge's office was on the 2nd floor of a building on Billings Main Street, and Thomas Aldridge himself was a small, precise man in his 50s with silver hair and a habit of tapping one finger against when he was thinking. He read the letter from Whitman, Cray, and Associates without expression, and then he set it down and tapped his finger 3 times. Denver jurisdiction, he said. That's the first thing. You've established residency in Montana how long? 11 weeks, Emma said. You purchased property here before you left Denver? 2 weeks before. Did you inform your husband of the purchase? No. Aldridge tapped his finger again. He'll argue you were in a state of diminished judgment. Pregnancy isolation, the stress of. He waved a hand. The usual. It's a common argument, and it's not always unsuccessful. What would make it unsuccessful? Emma asked. Evidence of stability, Aldridge said. Property, obviously, but also character witnesses. Community ties. Evidence that the child will be born into a safe, prepared environment. He looked at her directly. You're building the cabin yourself? I am. Alone? Largely. Aldridge looked at Nathaniel, who was sitting beside Emma and had said very little. He helps when I ask him to, Emma said. He doesn't make decisions. Aldridge nodded slowly. Something in his expression warmed slightly. I want to see the property, he said, before anything else. I want to see what you've built, and I want to see you on it. When? Emma said. End of next week, he said. I'll ride out myself. He leaned forward. In the meantime, I want you to document everything. Every nail you've driven, every decision you've made. Dates, materials, costs. I want a record that shows this was not an impulse. I want a record that shows a woman who plans. Emma opened her bag and set a leather notebook on his desk. I've been keeping one since I left Denver, she said. Aldridge picked it up. He paged through it. His expression went from professional to something that was, very briefly, surprised. My God, is it useful? Emma asked. Mrs. Caldwell, he said, this is the best piece of evidence I have ever been handed. The first twist came on the ride home. They were about 12 miles out of Billings, past the second creek crossing, when Nathaniel said, My father sent a telegram to Charles Whitman. Emma turned to look at him. Her voice was very calm when she spoke. When? 2 days ago, Nathaniel said. I found out this morning after you told me about the petition. His jaw was tight. I don't know what he said exactly, but I know my father, and I know he wants that land, and I know that Charles wanting you back, and my father wanting you gone both lead to the same place. Emma thought about this. She thought about it very carefully, the way she thought about load-bearing structures, about which joints would hold, and which would fail. Your father contacted my husband, she said, to tell him where I was. Probably, Nathaniel said. Yes, and to tell him what I'd built. Probably. Which means Charles didn't just find out from a general report, she said. He found out that I had succeeded, that I had built something real. She looked at the road ahead. He's not doing this because he's worried about the child. He's doing this because he's threatened. Nathaniel said nothing for a moment. Then about my father. Don't apologize for him, Emma said. He made his own choices. I know, but I brought this to your door, Emma. I came to your land first. I gave him the report. She looked at him then because he was using her name again, and she didn't think he knew he was doing it. Did you tell him to contact Charles? She asked. No. Did you tell him to interfere with my life? No. Did you do anything other than help me when I asked and hold your end of the plank when I needed it held? A long pause. Then stop apologizing, Emma said. And tell me what else you know about your father's dealings with Charles Whitman, because I need every piece of information I can get. He told her. Harlan Brooks had written to a contact in Denver, not to Charles directly, but to a business associate who knew Charles socially. He had mentioned, casually and with apparent concern, that a woman of his acquaintance was living in dangerous isolation on a Montana homestead in an advanced state of pregnancy, and that her husband in Denver seemed unaware of her situation. He had included the property location. It had taken Charles Whitman about a week to turn that information into a legal petition. What Harlan had not counted on, Nathaniel said, was his son finding out. And what Harlan had definitely not counted on was that his son would consider this a serious enough betrayal to feel it the way Nathaniel was clearly feeling it now, hands tight on the reins, shoulders squared. A particular silence around him that Emma was beginning to recognize as the way he contained things he was not ready to release. You're angry, she said. I'm angry. At your father. At the fact that he looked at what you've done out here and still saw a problem to be managed, instead of a person to be respected. His voice was level, but there was something burning underneath it. He's been doing this for 30 years, deciding what other people need without asking them. deciding what's best for land and cattle and family without asking anyone involved what they actually want. He paused. I've been watching him do it my whole life. I just didn't expect him to do it to you. Why not? Emma asked. The question sat between them. Because you make it impossible, Nathaniel said quietly. Because you're so clearly he stopped. Started again. Because anyone who has spent 5 minutes watching you work knows that you don't need anyone to decide anything for you. Emma felt something shift in her chest. Not the sharp ache of the hard days or the hollow feeling of the long nights. Something different. Something careful and new. She looked straight ahead at the road. We should get back before dark, she said. Yes, he said. But neither of them said anything else for a long time, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was, Emma thought, the rarest kind of silence, the kind you could live inside without disappearing. The baby came 6 days later. Not early. The midwife Emma had arranged with, a woman named Mrs. Sorensen, who lived 4 miles toward town and had delivered 43 children in the last 20 years, had told her the timing would be close to the original estimate. But Emma had not expected how quickly it would happen, or how alone she would be for the first part of it, or how strange it would feel to go through something that enormous in a cabin she had built herself with her own hands. She woke before dawn with the first real contractions and lay still for a moment, counting the rhythm of them. Then she got up, dressed carefully, banked the fire she'd built the night before, and sent a message to Mrs. Sorensen, with the boy from the neighboring farm who ran errands for her in exchange for eggs. She'd arranged this in advance, which was the kind of thing Emma arranged in advance. Mrs. Sorensen arrived within 2 hours. She was a solid, unflappable woman who had seen enough of birth and death to treat both with the same brisk, practical respect. She looked Emma over, asked 4 specific questions, and said, "You're further along than I expected. Let's get you settled." "I'm all right," Emma said. "You're doing fine," Mrs. Sorensen said firmly. "There's a difference." Emma labored through the morning and into the afternoon. And at some point during that stretch of time, the world reduced itself to something very simple and very physical: breath and motion, and the particular focus of a body doing the work it was built to do. She thought, in the strange clarity that comes with extreme physical effort, about the cabin walls. About how she had not known, when she started, that she would be able to do it. She had only known that she had to try. She thought about Charles. She thought about the morning she had told him about the pregnancy, and watched his face calculate. She thought about her daughter, because she knew it was a daughter. She had known for weeks in the wordless way that some women know things, and when Mrs. S. Sorensen placed the child in her arms in the late afternoon light and said, "A girl," Emma felt something close in her chest that had been open and bleeding for months. "Hello," she said softly. The child looked up at her with the unfocused, ancient gaze of the newborn, and Emma sat in the cabin she had built and held her daughter and did not cry, which surprised her, because she had expected to cry. Instead, she felt very clear, very still, like the moment just after the last nail goes in and the wall is standing, and you can finally step back and see the whole shape of what you've made. She named her Clara. Nathaniel found out the next morning when he rode out, and Mrs. Sorensen opened the cabin door. He stood in the doorway and looked at Emma in the chair by the fire holding the baby, and his expression did something complicated and unguarded that he probably would have controlled if he'd had a moment to prepare. "She's here," Emma said. "She's here," he said. He stood in the doorway for a moment, hat in his hands. "Come in," Emma said. He came in. He stood looking at Clara with an expression Emma had never seen on a man's face before, not performance, not the self-conscious warmth that men put on when they think they're supposed to look tender. Just actual feeling, unguarded and real, moving across his face the way light moves across open ground. "She's got your look," he said. "She's got her own look," Emma said. "She just got here." He almost smiled. "May I?" he said, reaching toward the baby. Emma held Clara out. He held her with the careful confidence of someone who had held babies before, adjusting his arm without being shown, supporting the head instinctively. Clara looked up at him with the same unimpressed assessment she had been giving everything since her arrival. "Hello," Nathaniel said quietly. Clara grabbed his finger. He stood very still for a moment, looking at that small hand around his finger. Then he looked up at Emma, and Emma looked at him, and neither of them said anything, and the fire crackled, and outside the cabin the Montana morning went about its business. "She's strong," Nathaniel said. "Yes," Emma said, "she is." He handed Clara back carefully, and Emma settled her, and they stayed like that for a while, in the particular quiet of a room where something important has just been understood without being said. The second letter from Charles arrived 8 days later. This one was longer than the first, and it was not written in lawyer language. It was written by Charles himself, in his own slanted hand, and it was 3 pages, and it was, in its way, the most frightening document Emma had ever received, because it sounded reasonable. He had heard, he wrote, that the child had been born safely. He was glad. He wanted her to understand that his petition was not about punishment. It was about practicality. Emma was a woman alone with a newborn in a remote location with an uncertain income and no family support. He was a man of means who could provide stability, education, and security for the child. Surely, he wrote, she could see that this was not about who was right or wrong. Surely she could see that this was simply about what was best. He also noted that he intended to appear at the custody hearing personally. And he noted, at the bottom of the 3rd page, almost as an afterthought, that he had been in contact with a Harlan Brooks of Red Hollow, Montana, who had expressed willingness to testify to the isolated and unstable conditions of Emma's residence. Emma set the letter down on the table. She looked at it for a moment. Then she went to the door of the cabin and opened it. Nathaniel was at the fence line, repairing a section she'd flagged the week before. He looked up. "I need you to read something," she called. He came. He read the letter at the table while Emma stood by the window with Clara, who was nursing with the focused determination that seemed to characterize everything Clara did. He read it twice, the way Emma had, and then he set it down and pressed one hand flat on the table. The silence in the room changed. "He knows about my father," Nathaniel said. "Your father offered," Emma said. "That's what it says." Nathaniel stood. He put his hat on. "I need to go talk to my father," he said. "Nathaniel." Emma looked at him. "Don't do anything that can't be undone." "I need witnesses, not problems." He looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said. "I know what I'm doing, do you?" "Yes," he said, "because unlike my father, I'm going to ask you what you need before I act." She looked at him. "I need witnesses who will tell the truth," she said. "That's all. The truth is enough." "All right," he said. "Then that's what I'll get." He rode out. He came back 3 hours later, and he did not tell her exactly what he had said to his father, and she did not ask. But something in his face told her that the conversation had crossed a line that would not easily be uncrossed. And she felt the weight of that, the fact that he had done it anyway. The week before the hearing, the town changed. It changed slowly, the way most things change, not in a single dramatic moment but in the accumulation of small ones. Mrs. Sorensen told the women at the Wednesday church gathering what she had witnessed at the cabin birth. How prepared Emma had been, how the cabin was clean and warm and solidly built. How Emma had not once asked to be told what to do or how to feel, but had moved through the hardest hours of her life with a steadiness that misses. Sorensen said she had only seen in a handful of women in 40 years of midwifery. The women at the Wednesday gathering told their husbands. The husbands talked. Carl Hess from the post office mentioned to anyone who would listen that the registered mail he'd seen coming in from a Denver law firm had a particular kind of smell to it, the kind where a man money was trying to take something that wasn't his. The boy from the neighboring farm, whose name was Daniel and who was 12 years old and enormously serious, told his mother that Mrs. Caldwell had taught him how to read a level properly, and that she was, in his considered opinion, the best builder in the county. his mother told 2 other women. And June Whitmore, sharp-faced June, who had stood in the doorway of Hale's general store and said she wouldn't last a month. June Whitmore came out to the cabin on a Tuesday afternoon with a jar of preserved peaches and stood in the doorway and looked at the interior of the cabin and at the baby in the cradle Emma had built from spare lumber, and she was very quiet for a long time. "I was wrong about you," June said finally. Emma looked at her. "I know," she said. June nodded. Something crossed her face that might have been shame, and then resolve. "I'll speak at the hearing if you need me to." "I might," Emma said. "Then I will," June said. She set the peaches on the table and left without another word. The night before the hearing, Emma sat at her table with her ledger and her documentation and went through everything, once, carefully, the way she went through any project, before the final stage, checking for gaps, checking for errors, checking that everything was where it was supposed to be. The land deed, filed and registered, the construction records. Every beam, every nail, every date. Thomas Aldridge's summary of her case. Clear, documented, specific. Mrs. Sorensen's written statement. Factual and detailed. Letters from 4 neighbors attesting to her presence in the community and her fitness as a parent. Her own notebook, 2 months of daily entries, meticulous and honest. She closed the ledger. Clara was asleep in her cradle, one hand curled against her cheek. Emma looked at her daughter for a long time. She thought about the woman she had been in Denver. The woman who had managed a household with precision and invisibility, who had organized everything and been credited with nothing, who had sat across a desk from a man she had promised her life to and listened to him explain her future to her as if her opinion were a formality. She thought about how far she had carried herself from that room. She thought about Nathaniel, about the way he had held Clara, about the way he drove nails alongside her without turning it into a lesson, about the way he had looked at her cabin walls and said, "like mine," with an understanding of what those words meant coming from her. She pressed her hands flat on the table. She was not afraid of Charles. She was not afraid of Harlan Brooks. She was not afraid of the hearing. She was afraid, she realized with sudden clarity, of something much smaller and much more specific. She was afraid of letting herself need someone again after learning so thoroughly what it cost. She was afraid that the careful distance she had built around herself was not wisdom but injury, a scar she had decided to call a wall. Clara made a small sound in her sleep. Emma stood. She went to the cradle and looked at her daughter. "Your mother is figuring something out," she said softly. "It's taking longer than she'd like, but she's working on it." She went to bed. Tomorrow, Charles Whitman was coming to Red Hollow. And Emma Caldwell, who had built something from nothing in a place where everyone expected her to fail, was going to walk into that courtroom carrying everything she had made, every record, every nail, every decision, every sleepless night. Every morning she had picked up the hammer when she didn't think she had anything left, and she was going to lay it all down in front of a judge and let the truth be the loudest thing in the room. She was ready. She had always been ready. She just hadn't known, until she was standing in front of an empty piece of Montana land with a canvas shelter and a box of tools, that this was what she had been building toward her entire life. Not the cabin, not even the land, herself. Charles Whitman arrived in Red Hollow on a Wednesday morning, and he arrived the way he did everything, with deliberate effect. He came in a hired coach, which was not a common sight on the main street of a town like Red Hollow, and he stepped down from it in a wool suit that cost more than most families in the county spent on clothes in a year. He was 41, lean, fair-haired, and had the particular kind of handsome that came from never having been seriously inconvenienced. He carried a leather briefcase. He had 2 lawyers with him, both from Denver, both wearing expressions that said they found the entire state of Montana mildly beneath them. Emma was not there to see him arrive. She was at her cabin, feeding Clara and reviewing her documentation with Thomas Aldridge, who had ridden out at dawn. He sat across the table from her with his silver hair and his tapping finger and a legal pad covered in his precise small handwriting. And he walked her through exactly what was going to happen in the hearing and exactly what Charles's lawyers were likely to do. "They'll come at the stability question first," Aldridge said. "They'll argue that a cabin on 40 acres of remote land with no family support structure and no guaranteed income is not an appropriate environment for an infant. The cabin has 4 walls, a roof, a functioning fireplace, and a kitchen area," Emma said. "Clara sleeps in a cradle I built from surplus lumber. The construction is sound. I know that. You know that. We need the judge to feel it." Aldridge tapped his finger once. "They'll also argue that you have demonstrated a pattern of impulsive decision-making. Leaving Denver without notice, purchasing land without consultation, building alone in an advanced pregnancy. Everything I did was documented and planned," Emma said. "The notebook covers every decision I made from the day I left Denver." "Good. That's our answer to impulsive." He looked at her. "The harder question is going to be income. Charles's lawyers will push on how you intend to sustain yourself and the child financially." "What's your answer?" Emma had thought about this for weeks. She had not built only a cabin. She had built a garden that was producing. She had a plan for the spring acreage, what she would plant, what it would yield, what she would sell, and at what price. She had run the numbers 3 times. She had written them down. She opened her notebook to a specific page and slid it across the table. Aldridge read it. He looked up. "You worked out a 5-year projection," he said. "I worked out a 10-year projection," Emma said. "The 5-year is the conservative estimate." Aldridge sat back. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, "I have represented 3 dozen homestead cases in this territory. I have never had a client hand me a 10-year agricultural projection. Is it useful?" "It is extraordinary," he said. Clara made a sound from the cradle. Emma went to her automatically, checked her, settled her back. When she turned around, Aldridge was looking at her with an expression that had moved past professional into something more personal. "I want you to know something," he said, "before we go into that room tomorrow. I want you to know that I have looked at everything you've built here, and I have looked at every document you've prepared, and I want you to know that what Charles Whitman is attempting is not just wrong legally. It is an insult to the evidence." Emma looked at him. "Win the case," she said. "That's what I need." "Yes, ma'am," Aldridge said. "That's what I intend to do." The hearing was set for 10 o'clock Thursday morning in the Red Hollow Municipal Building, which was a plain room with 8 rows of benches and a raised platform for the judge and the particular smell of old wood and coal dust that Emma would remember for the rest of her life. She arrived early. She wore her good dress, the dark blue wool she'd from Denver, altered slightly to account for the changes her body had gone through, and she wore her hair pinned cleanly, and she carried Clara's chest in the sling Mrs. Sorensen had shown her how to make. She had debated whether to bring the baby and had decided that leaving Clara with anyone else was not something she was willing to do. And that furthermore there was no argument Charles could make about maternal fitness, while Emma's daughter was content and warm and clearly healthy against her chest. It was, Aldridge had agreed when she explained her reasoning, a sound tactical decision. "It's also true," Emma had said. "That, too," he'd said. The benches filled quickly. Red Hollow was not a large town, but word had traveled Carl from the post office, Mrs. Sorensen, Daniel from the neighboring farm, June Whitmore, with 2 other women from the Wednesday gathering, 6 or 7 ranchers and their wives whose names Emma didn't yet know well, but whose faces she recognized from her supply runs. They came in quietly and filled the benches and sat with the attentive, particular stillness of people who have made up their minds about something and are waiting to see if the official world will agree with them. Nathaniel came in last and sat in the second row behind Emma. He did not sit beside her, she had not asked him to, and he had not offered, both of them understanding instinctively that the image of Emma standing on her own merits mattered more than any gesture of solidarity. But she felt him there, in the way you feel a solid wall behind you without touching it, and it steadied her. Charles Whitman came in with his 2 lawyers and took his place at the opposite table. He looked at Emma. Emma looked back at him. It was the first time she had seen him in 4 months. He looked the same as he always looked, precise, contained, faintly impatient with the world for not moving at his preferred speed. His gaze went from Emma's face to Clara, and something shifted in his expression, something quick and complicated that Emma couldn't entirely read. Then his lawyer leaned over and said something in his ear, and he looked away. The judge was a man named Horace Galway, 60 years old, with a reputation in the territory for being slow to speak and fast to understand. He came in, sat, arranged his papers, and looked out at the room with the mild assessment of a man who has seen this particular kind of disagreement many times. "This is a custody hearing," he said, "not a trial. I will hear from both counsel, I will hear from witnesses, and I will make a determination based on the best interests of the child. Everyone in this room will conduct themselves accordingly." He looked at the gallery. "That means quiet. Is that understood?" A general murmur of assent. "Good," Judge Galway said. "Mr. Prescott, you'll go first." Charles's lead lawyer, a man named Prescott, tall and thin with a voice designed for courtrooms, stood and went first. He was good. Emma had expected him to be good, and he was. He laid out Charles's case with the clean, unhurried confidence of a man who knew his argument was coherent and expected it to carry. He talked about Emma's departure from Denver sudden, unannounced, during an advanced pregnancy. He talked about the isolated nature of the homestead, 40 acres of remote territory, 4 miles from the nearest town. He talked about the physical demands of construction, which he characterized as reckless given Emma's condition. He talked about the absence of any family support system. He talked about Charles's ability to provide financially, socially, institutionally everything a child required for a stable upbringing. He was careful not to be overtly contemptuous of Emma. He framed everything as concern. He said the word welfare 17 times in 14 minutes. Emma counted. And then he said something that made the room go still. "We also intend to present testimony," Prescott said, "from a prominent local landowner who has had direct opportunity to observe Mrs. Caldwell's living situation and who has expressed significant concerns about its suitability." Judge Galway looked up. "Name of the witness?" Harlan Brooks, Prescott said. The room shifted. Emma felt it, the particular movement of a crowd that has just been handed new information and is deciding what to do with it. She did not turn around, but she heard very clearly the sound of Nathaniel's breath going out behind her. She felt something cold move through her chest and then settle. She had known this was coming. She had known it since she read the letter. She had prepared for it. But knowing a thing and hearing it said aloud in a room full of people who know who Harlan Brooks is, those were different experiences, and Emma allowed herself 2 seconds to feel the difference before she folded it away and looked at Aldridge. Aldridge was already making a note. He did not look concerned. This was either because he wasn't, or because he was very good at his job. Emma decided it didn't matter which. Prescott sat down. Aldridge stood up. He was not theatrical. He did not pace or gesture. He simply stood and spoke, and the way he spoke made everything he said feel inevitable. He established Emma's residency, documented, filed, legal. He established the property purchased before she left Denver, not on impulse but after 3 months of library research, not in ignorance but with full knowledge of the survey records and soil assessments and water table data. He established the construction weeks of documented progress, a structure that met or exceeded standard homestead requirements, built with systematic planning, and executed without assistance from anyone she hadn't specifically requested. He established the notebook. He held it up and he read from it not all of it, but specific entries, chosen with care. The entry from the 2nd week that recorded the block and tackle system she'd designed to raise beams without a crew. The entry from the 5th week that documented the drainage solution she'd implemented on the eastern quarter. The entry that recorded, in precise practical terms, the preparations she had made for Clara's birth, the arrangements with Mrs. Sorensen, the supply of clean cloth and water and lamp oil, the contingency plan if weather prevented the midwife from arriving on time. This, Aldridge said, setting the notebook on the table in front of the judge, is the record of a woman who does not make impulsive decisions. This is the record of a woman who plans, who prepares, and who executes. This is the record of a woman who built a safe home for her child before that child arrived, under conditions that would have defeated most people, and who did it not because she had no other choice, but because she had made a choice. A deliberate, documented, and considered choice. He paused. Mr. Prescott's client, he said, would like the court to believe that Mrs. Caldwell's independence is evidence of instability. We will show the court that it is evidence of exactly the opposite. He sat down. Judge Galway looked at the notebook for a moment. Then he said, "Call your first witness, Mr. Prescott." Prescott called a man from Denver, a family acquaintance who testified, carefully and with appropriate hedging, that Emma had seemed distracted and out of sorts in the months before she left, that she had withdrawn from social engagements, that people had been worried about her. He said the word worried 4 times. Aldridge cross-examined him for 3 minutes. You said Mrs. Caldwell withdrew from social engagements in the final months before she left Denver. Is that correct? That's correct. Were you aware that she was pregnant during this period? Yes, I believe so. And was she experiencing any physical discomfort during this period? I couldn't say. You couldn't say, Aldridge repeated pleasantly. In other words, you were not paying close attention to her actual experience. You were paying attention to her attendance at social events. Well, thank you, Aldridge said. No further questions. The Denver witness left and Prescott called Harlan Brooks. Harlan came in from the side door and walked to the witness chair with the unhurried stride of a man who owned most of what he could kiss, which in Red Hollow was a significant amount. He sat down. He looked at the judge. He did not look at his son. Nathaniel sat in the second row behind Emma and was very still. Emma looked straight ahead. Prescott asked his questions, and Harlan answered them in his large, carrying voice, and what he said was a careful architecture of partial truths, each one technically accurate and collectively misleading. He said Emma's land was remote. True. He said the construction he had observed was rough and unfinished at various stages. True, because he had observed it at various stages, before it was finished. He said he had concerns about a woman alone with an infant in a location with no immediate neighbors. He said it with the measured gravity of a man who genuinely believed he was doing a civic duty. He said he had discussed those concerns with Mr. Whitman in Denver out of a neighborly obligation to ensure the child's welfare. The room was quiet while he said it. Emma sat with her hands folded in her lap and Clara warm against her chest and kept her breathing even. Then Aldridge stood up. Mr. Brooks, he said, you testified that you have concerns about the stability of Mrs. Caldwell's living situation. That's correct. When did you first observe Mrs. Caldwell's property? About 2 months after she arrived. At that point was the cabin frame standing. A slight pause. Plumb and square? Another pause. It appeared to be. You have built structures yourself, Mr. Brooks. You know how to assess a frame. Would you say the frame you observed was the work of someone who didn't know what they were doing? Harlan's jaw tightened slightly. It was competent work. Competent work, Aldridge said. And when you contacted Mr. Whitman Denver, when you wrote to your mutual acquaintance with information about Mrs. Caldwell's location and situation, did you inform him that the cabin frame was competent work? A silence. I mentioned I had concerns. Did you inform him? Aldridge said, very clearly, that the cabin frame was competent work. I don't recall every detail of what I wrote. Did you inform him that Mrs. Caldwell had demonstrated, in your presence, detailed knowledge of the 1,879 land survey, the drainage patterns of the property, and the agricultural potential of the eastern quarter. Silence. I don't see how that's relevant. Did you inform him? Aldridge said, and there was no aggression in his voice, just a kind of steady precision that was more effective than aggression would have been. That your primary reason for contacting him was that you wanted to purchase Mrs. Caldwell's land and she had repeatedly refused to sell. The room moved. It moved like a single living thing, the whole gallery shifting forward by about an inch, a collective leaning in that was almost audible. Harlan Brooks's face did something that was not quite a flinch, but was the ancestor of one. I had legitimate concerns, Mr. Brooks, Judge Galway said quietly. Answer a long silence. The sale was one factor, Harlan said carefully. Among several. Aldridge looked at him for one moment. No further questions, he said. He sat down. Emma did not turn around. But she heard, very distinctly, the sound of June Whitmore exhaling behind her, and then the sound of a low murmur moving through the gallery like a wave. Judge Galway looked out at the room. Order, he said. The room went quiet. Call your next witness, Mr. Aldridge. Aldridge called Mrs. Sorensen. She came to the chair with the brisk confidence of a woman who has attended 43 births and testified in court twice before and is not impressed by either experience. She sat down, folded her hands, and waited. Aldridge asked her about the birth. She described it with a midwife's precision, the preparation Emma had made, the cleanliness of the cabin, the supplies laid in, the calm and methodical way Emma had moved through labor, the health of the infant at birth. She described the cradle Emma had built. She described the feeding schedule Emma had established in the first days. She described the way Emma had asked her, after the birth, to check the cradle construction for any sharp edges that might harm the baby. She asked you to check the cradle, Aldridge said. She did, Mrs. Sorensen said. She said she was 95% certain the joints were smooth, but she wanted a second set of eyes, because you don't take 5% chances with an infant. A sound moved through the gallery. Not a laugh exactly. Something warmer. Prescott cross-examined briefly and got nothing useful. Then Aldridge called June Whitmore. June came to the chair with her spine straight and her chin level. And she sat down and looked at the judge, and then looked at Emma with an expression that said she knew what she had said on the street 4 months ago and intended to correct the record. Aldridge asked her what she had observed of Emma Caldwell since her arrival in Red Hollow. June Whitmore talked for 7 minutes. She talked about the weekly supply runs and the way Emma came in, organized and efficient, and never bought more than she could carry or more than she immediately needed. She talked about the afternoon she had gone to the cabin and what she had seen there, the clean interior, the fire laid and burning, the food stores arranged carefully, the baby in a cradle that was, she said, better constructed than the one her husband, Hudgen, had bought, a carpenter in town, for their youngest. She talked about the way Emma had received her without warmth, June said honestly, which made the gallery murmur, but also without bitterness and without any desire for the kind of sympathy that would have been forgivable under the circumstances. She didn't need my apology, June said. She needed my respect. And she'd earned it whether or not I ever gave it. Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore, Aldridge said. Prescott chose not to cross-examine. Then Aldridge said, Your Honor, I'd like to call one final witness. Prescott looked up. We weren't informed. The witness's relevance became apparent during Mr. Brooks's testimony, Aldridge said calmly. I believe the court will find the testimony material. Judge Galway looked at him. The witness's name? Nathaniel Brooks, Aldridge said. The room went absolutely still. Emma felt it, the change in the air, the particular quality of a silence that has not settled but tensed. She did not turn around. She heard behind her the sound of a man standing. She heard Harlan Brooks's voice from the witness area, where he was still seated, just 2 words. Very low, Nathaniel. Don't. She heard Nathaniel walk past her to the front of the room. He sat in the witness chair. He looked like his father in the way that sons who have fought against resemblance always look like their fathers, the same jaw, the same shoulders, the same carrying quality of physical presence. But everything else was different. Where Harlan Brooks sat in a witness chair like a man who owned the room, Nathaniel sat like a man who was telling the truth and knew it would be enough. Aldridge asked him how long he had known Emma Caldwell. Since her second week on the property, Nathaniel said. My father sent me out to make an offer on the land. Mrs. Caldwell declined. And you continued to visit the property after that? I did. Nathaniel looked at Emma. She felt the look but did not turn. 'Cause I'd seen the work she was doing, he said. And I wanted to understand how someone did that alone. What specifically did you observe during your visits to the property? Nathaniel talked for 12 minutes. He talked about the block and tackle system Emma had rigged from the cottonwood trees. He talked about the precision of the notching work. He talked about the drainage solution on the eastern quarter, which he said was more sophisticated than anything he'd seen from professional builders in the county. He talked about the way Emma had run the project, the notebook, the lists, the systematic approach to every problem that arose. He talked about the day he offered to help with the wall plank and what Emma had said to him. She said, "You hold the plank. I drive the nails. And if you start making suggestions about how I should do this differently, I'll ask you to leave." He paused. I thought that was reasonable, so I held the plank. A sound moved through the gallery. The judge did not call for order. Mr. Brooks, Aldridge said, "Your father testified that he contacted Mr. Whitman in Denver out of concern for the child's welfare. What is your assessment of that characterization?" Prescott was on his feet. The witness. "The witness has direct knowledge of his father's motivations," Aldridge said. "He was present for conversations about the property and the petition." "I'll allow it," Judge Galway said. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "My father wants that land," he said. "He has wanted it since Mrs. Caldwell filed the deed. He believes a woman alone cannot maintain it, which means if her situation becomes untenable, the land becomes available. Contacting Mr. Whitman served that goal." He paused. "My father is not a cruel man, but he confused his interest with her welfare, and he let himself believe they were the same thing." "They are not." Silence. Harlan Brooks in the gallery said nothing. His face was a controlled landscape, but something in it had shifted, something around his eyes that looked, if Emma had been watching, like the first crack in a wall that has been under pressure for a very long time. "One final question," Aldridge said. "Mr. Brooks, in your observation of Emma Caldwell over the past months, have you seen any evidence that her living situation poses a risk to her daughter?" Nathaniel looked at Emma. She looked back at him, fully this time. She turned in her seat and looked at him across the room. "No," he said. "I have seen a woman who built a safe home for her child before the child arrived. I have seen a woman who planned for every contingency I could think of, and several I couldn't. I have seen a woman who asked for help when she needed it and didn't when she didn't." He paused. "I have not seen a woman who needed to be rescued. I have seen a woman who needed people to stop standing in her way." Prescott cross-examined for 9 minutes and failed to make a dent. Then it was Aldridge's turn to call Emma herself. She handed Clara to Mrs. Sorensen, who was sitting in the front row and took the baby with practiced ease, and Emma walked to the witness chair and sat down. The room was very quiet. She looked at Judge Galway and then at Aldridge and waited. Aldridge asked her why she left Denver. Emma thought for a moment about the many true answers to that question. Then she chose, as she usually did, the simplest one. "Because my husband had decided my life," she said. "Everything I did, everywhere I went, every role I played in my own home, he decided it. When I told him I was pregnant, his first question was what it meant for his schedule. His second question was which of his relatives I would stay with while I recovered from childbirth." She paused. "He never asked me what I wanted. He never asked me what I thought. In 6 years of marriage, I cannot recall a single conversation in which he asked me what I actually thought about anything. The room was still. "So you left," Aldridge said. "So I left," Emma said. "I purchased land I had researched thoroughly. I planned the construction carefully. I built the cabin. I had my daughter safely. I am raising her in a home I built with my own hands on land I own outright, with a financial plan that is documented and realistic." She looked at the judge. "I am not asking this court to believe I am a perfect mother. I am asking this court to look at the evidence and tell me what, specifically, Charles Whitman can provide that is better for my daughter than what I have already provided for her myself." Silence. "No further questions," Aldridge said. Prescott. He was careful. He was professional. He asked about the isolation. Emma answered with the names of 6 community members in the gallery who had been to her property and could testify to her community ties. He asked about income. Emma produced her 10-year projection and walked him through it line by line, and she saw on his face the particular expression of a man whose strategy is failing in real time. He asked about her decision to leave without informing her husband. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, "would you not agree that leaving without notice was at minimum a concerning indicator of judgment?" Emma looked at him. "I told my husband I was unhappy," she said. 3 times in 6 years. He listened to me the same way. He listened to everything I said, which is to say, he heard the sounds I was making and he waited for me to finish so he could tell me what he had already decided." She paused. "If a person tells you there is a fire in the building and you ignore them, and they leave the building, you do not then claim that their decision to leave was reckless." The room moved. Prescott looked at his notes. "No further questions," he said. Emma returned to her seat. Mrs. Sorensen handed Clara back. Clara grabbed Emma's finger with the same decisive grip she had given Nathaniel 3 weeks ago, and Emma held her daughter's hand and waited. Judge Galway looked at his papers for a long time. Then he said, "I've heard the arguments. I've reviewed the documentation submitted by counsel for Mrs. Caldwell." He tapped the leather notebook on his desk. "I've heard from 6 witnesses." He looked up. He looked at Charles Whitman. "Mr. Whitman," he said, "in your petition, you claim that your wife's living situation is unstable and unsuitable for an infant. Your counsel has been unable to identify a single piece of material evidence that supports this claim. The documentation before me shows a planned, systematic, and successful homestead establishment. The witnesses before me have described a woman of sound judgment, strong character, and evident competence as a parent." Charles Whitman's jaw was tight. "The evidence also suggests," the judge continued, "that this petition was motivated at least in part by third-party interests unrelated to the child's welfare." He looked briefly at Harlan Brooks in the gallery. "That does not sit well with this court." Charles's lead lawyer started to rise. "Sit down," Judge Galway said. The lawyer sat. "I am prepared to rule," Judge Galway said. "But before I do, I am going to say something that is not part of the legal record. I am going to say it because this room is full of people who drove here today to sit in these benches, and I think they deserve to hear it." He looked at Emma. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, "this court has seen a great deal of evidence today. But the most compelling evidence is not in that notebook, though that notebook is remarkable. The most compelling evidence is that you knew exactly what you were doing when you built that home, and you knew exactly why you were doing it, and you have not once in this proceeding asked anyone to feel sorry for you." He paused. "That is not a small thing." "Thank you, Your Honor," she said quietly. "Don't thank me yet," the judge said. "I still have to rule," and there was something in his voice that was almost dry, almost a warmth, before he composed himself again and looked at his papers. The room held its breath. The case was not over. Because just before the judge opened his mouth to speak the ruling, the door at the back of the room opened. And a man walked in. A man Emma had never seen before. He carried a leather satchel, and he walked directly to Aldridge's table and placed a document in front of him and leaned down and said something in Aldridge's ear. Aldridge went very still. He looked at the document. He looked up at the judge. "Your Honor," he said, "I need to request a brief recess." Prescott was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, we object." "I'll grant 5 minutes," Judge Galway said. He looked at Aldridge. "5 minutes, counselor." Aldridge took Emma by the arm and walked her to the side of the room and showed her the document. Emma read it. She read it twice. Then she looked at Aldridge. "Where did this come from?" she said. "A courthouse clerk in Denver," Aldridge said. His voice was careful and controlled, but there was something vibrating underneath it. "I had someone looking. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to raise your expectations. I didn't know if it would arrive in time." Emma looked at the document again. It was a deed. Not her deed. A deed to a property in Denver, a property Charles Whitman had signed over to a woman named Margaret Hale 6 weeks after Emma left. The deed transfer had been filed quietly, buried in a batch of routine recordings. The property was a house on the east side of Denver that Emma had never heard of. The transfer included a note of consideration money paid, but the amount was suspiciously low. The kind of low that suggested the exchange was not a simple sale. Emma's hands were very steady. "He has another woman," she said. "It appears so," Aldridge said. "He filed a custody petition claiming I was unfit," Emma said, "while he was transferring property to another woman in Denver." "Yes." Emma looked at the door of the room, where Charles Whitman was standing with his lawyer, watching her across the distance. He knew. She could see it in his face. He knew what was in the document. He had seen the man come in. He knew what was about to happen. And for the first time since she had walked into that room, Emma saw something on Charles Whitman's face that she had never seen there before. Fear, not of losing the case, of what the case was going to reveal. Emma handed the document back to Aldridge. "Use it," she said. "Are you certain?" he said. "Once it's in the record." "Use it," she said again. She walked back to her seat. She sat down. She looked straight ahead. Clara was warm against her chest. The 5 minutes passed. Judge Galway returned, and Aldridge stood up with the deed in his hand, and the room, which had already reached a tension it didn't seem like it could exceed, went somewhere beyond that. What came next was not loud. It did not need to be. The truth, laid plainly in front of a judge who was paying attention, does not require volume. Aldridge presented the document. He explained its significance. He asked the judge to consider what it said about the sincerity of Charles Whitman's claim that this petition was about his daughter's welfare. Prescott objected 4 times. The judge overruled 4 times. Charles Whitman sat at his table and looked at the surface of it. He did not look at Emma. He did not look at Clara. He did not look at anyone. And Emma, watching the man who had once arranged her entire life as if she were furniture to be positioned, felt something she had not expected to feel. Not triumph, not even relief. Something quieter than both. Something that felt, for the first time in a very long time, like the world was finally, imperfectly, approximately fair. Judge Galway looked at the deed for a long time. Then he closed the folder in front of him. "I've heard enough," he said. "I've heard enough," Judge Galway said. And the room stopped breathing. Not figuratively. Emma felt it, the actual, physical cessation of movement in the gallery behind her. 30 people simultaneously, holding air in their lungs, waiting. Clara stirred against her chest, making the small sound she made when she was about to wake, and Emma pressed one hand gently against her daughter's back and felt the tiny heartbeat, steady and indifferent to the proceedings, beating its own reliable rhythm while the world decided things. Judge Galway looked at his papers one final time. Then he looked up. "In the matter of Whitman versus Caldwell," he said, "this court finds in favor of the respondent. Full custody of the minor child Clara Caldwell is awarded to her mother, Emma Caldwell, of Red Hollow, Montana. Mr. Whitman's petition is denied in its entirety." He set down his pen. "Furthermore," he said, and his voice carried a weight that was not quite anger, but was something with similar density. "This court notes for the record that the petition before us today was filed on the basis of allegations that the evidence does not support. and was influenced by third-party motivations that have no place in a proceeding concerning a child's welfare. This court does not look favorably upon the use of family court proceedings as instruments of financial or personal interest. He looked at Prescott. Counsel will inform his client accordingly. Prescott said nothing. Charles Whitman said nothing. He was still looking at the table. Cowboy gathered his papers. "This court is adjourned," he said, and stood, and the room erupted. It erupted the way rooms do when a tension that has been building for hours finally breaks not in chaos but in noise and movement. In the particular energy of people who have been holding their opinions carefully for several hours and are now allowed to let them go. Emma heard it behind her like a wave. She heard June Whitmore's voice, high and clear, saying something that was probably not appropriate for a courthouse. She heard Carl Hess laughing. She heard Mrs. Sorensen, who was not a demonstrative woman, say good with such concentrated satisfaction that it cut through everything else. Emma sat very still in the middle of it. Clara had woken at the noise and was looking around with the wide, unimpressed assessment of a 3-week-old confronting a new sonic environment. Emma watched her daughter's face, the small furrowed brow, the searching eyes, and felt something move through her so large and so quiet that it had no name. She became aware of Thomas Aldridge beside her. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said. "You won," he said. "We won," Emma said. He shook his head slightly. "I gave you the courtroom. You gave me everything that mattered." He picked up his legal pad and the leather notebook and held the notebook out to her. "You'll want to keep this." She took it. She pressed it against her chest, next to Clara, and for one moment she let herself close her eyes. She had started that notebook in a Denver library on a gray February morning, sitting at a table by the window while her husband was 3 miles away discussing her future with his lawyers. She had opened to the first page and written, in her careful hand, at the top, what I need, what I know, what I intend to do, and then she had started the list. She had not known, that morning, that she would be sitting in a Montana courtroom 5 months later with the list completed. She opened her eyes, she stood up, and she came face to face with Charles Whitman. He was standing 3 feet away, without his lawyers, which surprised her. She had not seen him approach, had not expected him to try. He stood with his hat in his hands and his leather briefcase at his side, and he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face in 6 years of marriage. He looked uncertain. "Emma," he said. "Charles," she said. Clara looked at him with the same unimpressed assessment she gave everything. Charles looked at Clara. Something crossed his face, something that might have been in a different man under different circumstances, genuine feeling. But Emma had spent 6 years watching Charles Whitman's face, and she knew how to read the difference between feeling and the performance of feeling, and she was not entirely sure which one this was. And she understood with a clarity that surprised her that she no longer needed to figure it out. "She looks like you," he said. "She looks herself," Emma said. "She just got here." He was quiet for a moment. "I want you to know," he said, "that I didn't." He stopped. Started again. The petition wasn't meant to be. "Charles," Emma said. "Don't," she said. Not unkindly, but clearly. "Don't explain it. Don't justify it. Don't tell me what you meant. I know what you did. The court knows what you did." She looked at him steadily. "Go back to Denver. Take care of your business. Leave us alone." He stood for a moment. Then he put his hat on. "Goodbye, Emma," he said. "Goodbye, Charles," she said. He walked to the door. His lawyers fell in behind him. The hired coach was waiting outside. And Charles Whitman, who had arrived in Red Hollow with money and leverage and the absolute conviction that the world would arrange itself into court preferences, left it with nothing he hadn't brought with him. Emma watched him go. She did not feel what she had expected to feel. She had imagined this moment, the departure of the man who had defined the last 6 years of her life, and she had expected it to feel like something ending. A door closing, a final punctuation mark. Instead, it felt like clearing weather. like the moment after a long rain when the sky goes from gray to that specific clean blue that makes everything look freshly made. She turned back to the room. Nathaniel was standing 10 feet away, hat in hand, watching her. He had not approached while Charles was there. He had given her the space to handle it herself, which was, she had come to understand, one of his most consistent and reliable qualities, the ability to be present without occupying space that wasn't his. She walked to him. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he said. They stood looking at each other for a moment in the middle of the emptying room, with Mrs. Sorensen cooing at Clara behind them, and June Whitmore organizing some kind of celebratory gathering at her house, and Carl Hess still laughing at something across the room. And the particular warm chaos of people who are happy on behalf of someone they've chosen to care about. "Your father," Emma said. Nathaniel's jaw tightened slightly. "I know. He's going to be very unhappy with you." "He was unhappy with me before today," Nathaniel said. "He'll survive it." "Nathaniel." She said his name carefully, meaning it as a question. "What did you say to him? Before the hearing, when you went to talk to him?" He was quiet for a moment. "I told him that I was going to tell the truth on that stand," he said. "And I told him that if he had any decency left in him, he would do the same." He paused. "He didn't agree with my assessment of the situation." "And now? And now we'll see," Nathaniel said. "My father is a complicated man. He does things for what he believes are good reasons, and he's not always wrong about the reasons, just about the methods." He looked at Emma. "He was wrong about the methods." Emma nodded. She looked down at Clara, who had fallen back asleep against her chest with the decisive efficiency of an infant who has determined that the crisis is resolved and rest is now appropriate. "Come for supper tonight," Emma said. "You and just you." "I'll cook." Something moved in Nathaniel's face. Not surprise exactly. Something quieter than surprise. "All right," he said. Yes. They left the courthouse into a bright Montana afternoon. And the people of Red Hollow who had come to sit in those benches surrounded Emma on the steps in the way that small communities do when they have decided something about a person when they have moved them from the category of stranger to the category of theirs. Daniel from the neighboring farm was there, 12 years old and solemn, and he said, "I knew you'd win, Mrs. Caldwell," with such absolute conviction that several people laughed. June Whitmore pressed Emma's hand between both of hers and said something very quiet that Emma heard and did not repeat. Mrs. Sorensen told her to rest and drink water and eat a proper meal and was already organizing who would bring what. Emma stood in the middle of it and let it happen. She had spent her whole life managing the households of others, keeping their spaces running smoothly, making sure everyone around her had what they needed. She was not practiced at being on the receiving end of care. It felt unfamiliar. It felt in the way that many unfamiliar things do, like something she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. She drove home in the late afternoon, with Clara asleep in the basket beside her on the cart. The cabin was waiting for her, solid and square against the sky. She unhitched the cart, checked the animals, went inside, and stood in the middle of the room she had built and looked at the walls. Every plank, every joint, every decision she had made about height and spacing and which beam went where. She knew this room the way she knew her own body, every imperfection, every place where she'd corrected a mistake, every section that had gone exactly right the first time, and the satisfaction that had come with it. She set the basket down near the fire and went to the kitchen area and started cooking. She was not a demonstrative woman. She did not weep. She did not collapse. She chopped vegetables and salted a piece of meat and set things in the pot and worked with the same systematic attention she brought to everything, and somewhere in the middle of it she started to laugh. Not at anything in particular, just at the fact of it. At the specific, improbable, extraordinary fact of standing in a cabin she had built herself, in a state she had chosen, cooking a meal in a kitchen she had fitted plank by plank, on the day a judge in Red Hollow. Montana had looked at Charles Whitman's lawyers and said no. She laughed until Clara startled awake and looked at her with enormous, reproachful eyes. "Sorry," Emma said, and went to pick her up. "Your mother is having a moment." Clara regarded her with skepticism. "You're right," Emma said. "I'll compose myself." Nathaniel arrived at 6 o'clock with a bottle of cider because he didn't know if Emma drank whiskey and had decided not to assume. She did, as it happened, drink whiskey on occasions that warranted it, and she told him this, and he smiled and said he'd know for next time. And there was a particular ease in that small exchange, in the implicit next time, that Emma registered without remarking on. They ate at the table she had built, in the chairs she had built, by the light of the lamp she had hung, and they talked. Not about the hearing, not about Charles or Harlan or Aldridge or any of it. They had talked about all of that enough. They talked about Clara, about the way she had grabbed the judge's pen when Aldridge held her briefly near the bench, causing the most genuine smile anyone had seen on Horace Galway's face in his 20 years on the bench. They talked about the spring planting. Emma had plans, detailed plans, drawn up in the same notebook that had won her case. And she walked Nathaniel through them because he knew the land and the soil and the season better than anyone she had access to, and his input was useful. And she had learned to recognize the difference between useful input and the kind that came wrapped in the assumption that she needed correcting. His input never came wrapped that way. Halfway through supper, he said, without prelude, "My father came to see me this afternoon." Emma looked up. "Before the supper or after?" she said. "After. About an hour after the hearing." Nathaniel set down his fork. He didn't apologize. That's not something my father does in any recognizable form. But he sat down and he was quiet for a while, and then he said he paused. He said, "I don't know what I thought would happen." Emma was quiet. "I told him," Nathaniel said, "that what he thought would happen was that you'd be frightened back to Denver, and the land would become available, and he'd get what he wanted, having to reckon with what he'd done to get it." He picked up his fork again. He didn't disagree. "Is that progress?" Emma asked. "For my father," Nathaniel said. "That's extraordinary." She almost smiled. "What happens now?" she asked. "Between you and him?" Nathaniel thought about it. "We work on it," he said. "The way you work on anything that's damaged but not beyond repair. Carefully, over time, with realistic expectations." He looked at her. "That's not a short answer, but it's the honest one." "I prefer honest ones," Emma said. "I know," he said. "It's one of the first things I understood about you." The fire had burned down by the time they finished eating, and the evening had gone fully dark outside, and Claire was asleep again, with the trusting abandon of the deeply comfortable infant. Emma sat across the table from Nathaniel in the light of the lamp and felt the specific quality of the evening, the warm, quiet, particular feeling of a day that has been survived and survived well. "Can I ask you something?" Nathaniel said yes. "When you left Denver," he said. "When you were on that wagon coming here, were you afraid?" Emma considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Every single minute," she said, "the whole way. But you came anyway." "I was more afraid of what I was leaving than of what I was going toward," she said. Fear of the wrong thing is very clarifying. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her. "Emma," he said. She waited. "I need to tell you something," he said. "And I want to tell you clearly, without dressing it up in something it isn't, because I think you have had enough of people not saying what they mean." Emma sat very still. "I am in love with you," Nathaniel said. "I have been since about the third week I watched you raise a wall alone on a rig you invented from rope and 2 trees. I am not telling you this because I expect anything to come of it immediately, or because I think the timing is anything other than terrible. I'm telling you because you deserve to know it, and because I have been not telling you for long enough that it has started to feel like its own kind of dishonesty." He paused. "I'm not asking you anything tonight. I just needed you to know." Emma looked at him. The fire crackled. Clara breathed. Outside, the Montana night was doing what it always did, the wind in the grass, the creek in the dark, the enormous indifferent sky full of stars that did not care at all about the specific gravity of what was happening in a small lit cabin on 40 acres of forgotten land. "I know," Emma said. Nathaniel was very still. "You knew," he said. "I'm not unobservant," she said. "And you are not subtle in your way." "Why didn't you?" "Because I wasn't ready," she said. "And because I needed to know if it would change how you behaved toward me if I didn't respond the way you might have wanted. I needed to know if you would stay the same person." She paused. "You did." He looked at her. "And now?" he said. Emma looked at her hands on the table. The hands that had driven 10,000 nails. The hands that had raised walls and notched joints and held her daughter into the world and set a leather notebook in front of a judge in Red Hollow, Montana. "Now," she said carefully, "I am a woman who just finished the hardest year of her life. I have a daughter who is 3 weeks old. I have 40 acres and a cabin and a spring planting to plan and more work ahead of me than behind me." She looked up at him. "I am not someone who has room in her life right now for anything that isn't true and isn't patient and isn't entirely sure of itself." "I'm sure," Nathaniel said. "I know you think you are," she said. "I'm asking you to be sure over time, not in a single evening." He held her gaze. "It's not a no," Emma said. "I know," he said. "I can tell the difference." She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had held the other end of the plank without being asked something, who had stood in a courtroom and told the truth when it cost him something, who had said "I love you" without demanding an answer. "Come back tomorrow," she said. "Help me start the second fence line. I've been putting it off because the post holes are difficult and I could use an extra pair of hands." Nathaniel's mouth curved. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He left at 8 o'clock, the way he always did, on time, without drama, saying what he meant when he said good night and nothing more. Emma stood in the doorway and watched him ride out into the dark and then came inside and sat down by the fire. She thought about what she had said and what he had said and what neither of them had said, and she thought it was probably as honest an exchange as she had ever had with a man, and that struck her as both remarkable and very simple, which was, she was beginning to understand what things felt like when they were right. The following week brought a letter she had not expected. It came from Denver, but not from Charles and not from any law firm. It was addressed in a woman's handwriting, neat, careful, slightly tentative, in the way of someone who is not accustomed to writing letters they aren't sure will be well received. The woman's name was Margaret Hale. Emma sat down when she read that name. She read the letter once. Then she read it again. Margaret Hale was 26 years old. She had been working as a clerk in a Denver office building when Charles Whitman had taken an interest in her 2 years ago. She had believed she wrote this with a plainness that Emma recognized as the kind of courage it takes to tell a humiliating truth. She had believed that Charles's intentions were honorable. She had believed the house he arranged for her was the beginning of something permanent. She had not known, she wrote, that Charles had a wife. She had not been told. She found out the morning after the hearing. From the Denver newspapers, which had apparently covered the Red Hollow custody case with rather more interest than anyone in Red Hollow had anticipated. Emma set the letter down. She pressed both hands flat on the table. She thought about a 26-year-old woman in Denver reading a newspaper account of a court proceeding and understanding, all at once, what kind of man she had trusted. The specific quality of that moment, the floor going out from under a world you had believed was solid. She thought about herself at 22, believing that Charles Whitman was a man of his word. She picked up her pen. She wrote back. She wrote clearly and without excess that she did not hold any of it against her, that she understood exactly how Charles operated, that she was sorry for what Margaret had been put through, and that if she ever needed help navigating her situation legally, Thomas Aldridge in Billings was a man of exceptional integrity. She signed it Emma Caldwell and sent it the next morning. She did not tell anyone about this exchange, not because she was ashamed of it, but because it was between herself and another woman who had been wronged by the same man, and some things belong only to the people who share them. Nathaniel came back the next day, and the day after that. The fence line went in over 2 weeks, and then the spring planting started, and then there was the question of the additional acreage on the northern end of the property, which Emma had initially planned to leave fallow for the first year, but which Nathaniel suggested carefully, with full acknowledgement that it was only a suggestion might support oats if the soil was prepared by midsummer. She looked at the soil assessment. She looked at her planting schedule. She revised the schedule. She told him he was right about the oats. He was careful not to look too pleased about this, which was its own form of consideration, and she appreciated it. They fell into a pattern that was neither courtship nor simple friendship, but something that occupied the honest space between them, two people who had said true things to each other and were now living alongside those true things, neither rushing toward them nor retreating. June Whitmore, who had become something approaching a genuine friend, said to Emma one Wednesday with considerable frankness, "That man is waiting for you to tell him it's time." "I know," Emma said. "How much longer are you going to make him wait?" Emma thought about it. "Until it feels like choosing," she said, "and not like settling." June looked at her. "Is there a difference in your case?" "Yes," Emma said, "a significant one." June was quiet for a moment. "Then fair enough." The twist came in late April. Harlan Brooks arrived at Emma's cabin on a Tuesday morning, alone, without notice, and knocked on the door. Emma opened it. They looked at each other across the threshold. Harlan Brooks was a big man, and he looked, this morning, somewhat less certain of his size than usual. His hat was in his hands. His horse was tied at the fence post. He had come alone, which she took as meaningful. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, "I'd like to speak with you, if you're willing." Emma looked at him for a long moment. "Come in," she said. He came in. He sat in the chair across the table, the chair Nathaniel always used, which she noticed and said nothing about, and he put his hat on the table and folded his hands and looked at Claire in the cradle for a moment before looking at Emma. "I owe you an apology," he said. Emma waited. "I contacted Whitman," he said. "I've told myself different stories about why, but the truth is straightforward. I wanted your land, and I was willing to use a back channel to get it. What I told myself about your welfare and the child's welfare was something I believed enough to repeat, but not enough to act on honestly." He paused. "That's a distinction I've been thinking about since this hearing." Emma said nothing. "My son," Harlan said, and something shifted in his voice on those words, something that was not easy for him. She could hear the cost of it. "My son made a choice in that courtroom. He chose you over what I wanted, over what I had built, over 30 years of my telling him what mattered." He looked at his hands. "I have been angry about it." He paused. "I am not angry about it anymore." "What changed?" Harlan looked up at her. "He came to see me last week," he said. "He brought Clara." Emma went very still. "He didn't ask your permission," she said. "He said he was going to introduce his father to the most important person in Red Hollow," Harlan said, "and that the rest was up to me." Emma thought about Nathaniel, about the absolute consistency of him, about the way he found the exact right thing to do and did it without announcement. "She grabbed my finger," Harlan said. "The same way Nathaniel did when he was new." He stopped. Something worked in his face that was very old and very private. "I forgot that feeling. I forgot I ever felt it." He looked at Emma. "I would like to repair some of what I broke. I do not expect you to forgive me immediately, and I am not asking you to. I am asking for the opportunity to demonstrate that I am capable of better than what I showed." Emma looked at him, this man who had tried to use a court proceeding and a frightened woman's legal peril to take her land. This man who was also Nathaniel's father and who sat now in her cabin, holding his hat and asking for something he had not earned. She thought about Margaret Hale's letter, about the courage it took to tell a true thing about yourself when the truth was not flattering. She thought about what she was teaching Clara, every day, simply by living the way she lived. "I'll make coffee," Emma said. Harlan looked at her. "That's yes," he said. "Thank you." She made coffee. They sat across from each other for an hour, and it was not comfortable, and it was not warm, and it was not the beginning of a friendship. But it was honest. He told her more about the land dealings, not all of it, but enough. She told him, clearly and without embellishment, what the petition had cost her in sleepless nights and legal fees and the specific anxiety of knowing someone was trying to take her daughter. He did not flinch from it. He stayed exactly 1 hour. When he stood to leave, he looked at Clara. "She's going to be something," he said. "Yes," Emma said. He put his hat on. He paused at the door. "My son," he said without turning around. "He's been building something too. You might have noticed." He opened the door. "I hope you'll let him finish it." He left before she could respond. Emma stood in the open doorway and watched Harlan Brooks mount his horse and ride back toward the east, where the Brooks Ranch sat on its 3,000 acres. And she thought about what it cost a man like that to walk up to a woman's cabin door with nothing in his hands. She thought it probably cost him more than he would ever say. She closed the door. She picked up Clara. "Your grandfather is a complicated man," she said. Clara looked at her with dark, serious eyes. "So is mine," Emma said. "So is everyone eventually, if you know them long enough." She set Clara down and went to her desk and opened the notebook. She turned to a new page. At the top she wrote, "What comes next?" And she started the list. What comes next? She had written those 3 words at the top of a clean page, and then she had sat looking at them for a long time before she started writing anything beneath them. Because what came next was not a problem to solve or a structure to build or a legal battle to win. What came next was quieter than all of that, and in some ways more frightening, because it required her to decide not just what she would do, but who she intended to become, now that the doing was no longer purely about survival. The spring of 1887 arrived the way Montana springs always did, abruptly, with a kind of aggressive optimism that felt almost personal. One week the ground was still hard with cold, and the creek ran gray, and then suddenly the grass came up green, and the air changed character entirely, and Clara, who was now 2 months old, and had developed a series of opinions about the world that she expressed with great clarity, started watching the light move across the cabin walls with the attentiveness of someone receiving a message. Emma planted the oats on the northern acreage in the first week of April, the way Nathaniel had suggested, and her revised schedule had confirmed. She worked the rows herself in the mornings, while Clara slept in the basket she moved from spot to spot down the field. And in the afternoons, she worked the kitchen garden, the beans and the squash and the root vegetables that would carry them through the next winter, without the anxiety of the last one. She was not anxious about this winter. That was new. Nathaniel came 4 days a week now, sometimes 5, and the work they did together had developed its own language, the particular shorthand of 2 people who have learned how the other thinks and no longer need to explain every step. He knew when she wanted to talk through a problem and when she had already solved it and just needed an extra set of hands. She knew when something was sitting heavy on him and when he needed to work it out in silence rather than words. They operated at a frequency of mutual understanding that Emma had not known was possible between a man and a woman, because she had never seen it modeled and had not known to look for it. One morning in late April, Daniel from the neighboring farm came running across the field with the seriousness of a 12-year-old delivering urgent news. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, slightly breathless, "there's a man at the road. Says he's got a letter for you from Denver." Emma set down her trowel. The letter was from Thomas Aldridge. He wrote that Charles Whitman's lawyers had contacted him the previous week with a proposal. Charles was prepared to sign a full legal relinquishment of parental rights in exchange for Emma's agreement not to pursue any additional legal action arising from the petition. He had consulted with the Denver Family Court and the Montana Territorial Court and was passing the offer along without recommendation, except to note that the offer itself told her something significant about the strength of her position. Emma read the letter at her kitchen table with Clara on her lap and thought about it for a long time. She was not surprised. She had known, watching Charles walk out of that courthouse, that he would look for a way to close the door cleanly. Charles had always preferred clean surfaces. It was one of the things that had made him appear trustworthy before she'd understood that a clean surface is not the same thing as an honest one. She wrote back to Aldridge the same afternoon. She agreed to the terms. Not because she was afraid of further legal action. She had won once, and she was prepared to win again. But because Clara deserved a clean door too. Because whatever complicated grief or complication might arise as her daughter grew and started asking questions about her father, it would be easier to answer those questions from a place of legal clarity than from ongoing entanglement. Because Emma had already spent enough of her life managing Charles Whitman's presence in it, and she was done. She sent the letter with Daniel, who was developing a business running correspondence for her, and considered it a considerable point of professional pride. When Nathaniel came the next morning, she told him. He was quiet for a moment. "How do you feel?" he said. "Finished," Emma said, in the good sense. "The way a wall feels when the last plank is in." He nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "That's good." He looked at her in the way he had started looking at her more directly lately, not the careful, measured glances of the early months when he was deciding how much to show, but something more open. Something that was getting harder to look at without looking back. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" she said. "About what I said at supper in March," he said, "and what you said back. And about whether the time I asked for has been enough time." Emma looked at him. Clara, on her hip, grabbed a fistful of Emma's hair and held on. "I told you it wasn't a no," Emma said. "I know," he said. "I'm asking if it's moved." Emma looked at this man who had held the other end of the plank, who had sat in a witness chair and told the truth when it cost him, who had brought his father to meet Clara without being asked, because he understood instinctively that it was the right thing to do, who had never once, in all the months she had known him, tried to decide anything for her. "It's moved," she said. "He was very still," he said. Toward she confirmed. Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile, and was larger than a smile, a full, unguarded thing that he made no effort to contain. And she thought that this was probably one of the things she loved about him. That he didn't manage his expressions around her, that he let her see what was actually happening in him. "I'm not in a hurry," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I have not been subtle about how I feel, but I don't want you to feel." "Nathaniel," she said. He stopped. "I know," she said. "I know what you are. I've been watching for a long time." She shifted Clara to her other hip. "Come for supper on Friday. Bring something decent to drink. We can talk about what toward looks like." "Yes, ma'am," he said. And the warmth in those two words was so particular that Emma had to look away before she said something she wasn't ready to say yet. She went back to her garden. He went back to the fence line. And Clara regarded the whole exchange with the expression she had been perfecting for 2 months, which was the expression of someone who found the adults around her simultaneously essential and baffling. The second twist of the spring came from a direction Emma had not expected. A woman arrived at her cabin on a Thursday afternoon in May alone, in a rented cart, with a single bag and an expression of someone who has been making difficult decisions for long enough that they have become simply the texture of daily life. She was perhaps 26, dark-haired, plainly dressed, and she stopped at the edge of the property and looked at the cabin before she looked for Emma. Emma was at the side of the house, checking the drainage she'd installed on the eastern quarter. She looked up. She knew immediately. She walked to the fence line, and the woman in the cart looked at her and said, "You're Emma Caldwell." "I am," Emma said. "I'm Margaret Hale," the woman said. Emma opened the gate. "Come in," she said. "I'll make coffee." Margaret Hale came in. She sat at the table in the chair across from Emma, the same chair June Whitmore had sat in. The same chair Harlan Brooks had sat in, and she looked around the cabin, with an expression that was trying to hold several different feelings at once and not entirely succeeding. "You built this," she said. "I did," Emma said. "The paper said you built it yourself." She looked at the walls. "I didn't. I thought that was..." She stopped. "It's very good." "Thank you," Emma said. She set the coffee down and sat across from her. Margaret Hale looked at Clara in the cradle and then looked back at Emma with an expression that was, in its way, the most honest thing Emma had seen in a long time because it was so clearly not performed. It was just a woman sitting across from another woman and reckoning with what had happened to both of them. "I got your letter," Margaret said. "When I wrote to you, I didn't know if you'd write back. And then when you did, she pressed her hands flat on the table. "I've been in Denver for 3 months since the hearing, and I kept thinking about what you said in your letter. About Thomas Aldridge, and about not holding things against me." She looked at Emma directly. "I needed to come and see for myself that you were real." Emma looked at her. "I'm real," she said. "I know," Margaret said. "I know that now." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't have anywhere particular to go," she said. "After Denver, I came from Ohio originally. My family is the situation's not one I can return to." She paused. "I've been reading about Montana homestead filings." Emma looked at her. "The process is not complicated if you're organized," Emma said carefully. "The research takes time. The physical work is significant." "I'm not afraid of physical work," Margaret said. "No," Emma said. "I don't imagine you are." She looked at this woman across her table, 26 years old, alone, starting over, looking at a cabin that someone had built from nothing and calculating whether she might do the same. "Tell me what you know about the available parcels." Margaret's eyes went slightly wide. "I looked at 3, she said. "I made notes." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Emma looked at the notes. They were organized, clear. She had cross-referenced the parcel locations with the water table information from county records and had made comments on each. Emma looked up. "The parcel on the Miller Creek watershed," she said. "Why did you rate it 3rd? The access road is poor," Margaret said. "And the southern exposure is partially blocked, which would affect the kitchen garden." Emma set the paper down. "It's the best one," she said. "The access road can be improved in a season. The southern exposure issue disappears if you orient the cabin correctly." She looked at Margaret. "But the soil on the eastern quarter is excellent, and the creek is reliable year-round, which the other 2 are not." Margaret looked at her. "How do you know all that?" she said. "Because I read the same surveys you did," Emma said, "and then I wrote out to look at all 3 before I filed on mine." She pushed the paper back across the table. "You should go look at it yourself before you decide. Looking is different from reading. Will you?" Margaret stopped. "Yes," Emma said. "I'll ride out with you tomorrow if you want. I know the county assessor, and he'll pull the current filing status without making you wait a week." Margaret Hale looked at her across the table. "Why are you helping me?" she said. It wasn't suspicious, it was genuinely simply curious. The question of a woman who had learned to expect that generosity from strangers usually came attached to something. Emma thought about the answer. "Because someone should have helped me sooner," she said. "And because you wrote me an honest letter when you didn't have to, and honesty is the thing I value most and see the least of." She picked up her coffee. "And because Red Hollow has room for another woman who isn't afraid of hard work." Something shifted in Margaret's face. Something that had been held very tight for a very long time started, slowly and carefully, to loosen. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," Emma said. "File the deed." Margaret Hale filed on the Miller Creek parcel 2 weeks later. She stayed in town at Mrs. Sorensen's spare room while she arranged the materials, and Emma rode out with her twice to look at the land. And Aldridge helped with the paperwork at a reduced rate because he said the alternative was charging a woman trying to build a life from nothing full price, which he declined to do. Nathaniel helped Margaret identify a reliable lumber supplier and a delivery route that didn't require crossing the difficult Second Creek at high water season. Emma watched all of this happen with the particular feeling of someone who has set something in motion and is watching it find its own shape. June Whitmore brought Margaret into the Wednesday gathering. Margaret sat in the corner at first and said very little, which was, Emma thought, the right instinct in a new room with new people. But by the third week she was contributing to the conversation, and by the fourth week she was arguing with June Whitmore about the best way to preserve summer produce, which Emma considered a significant milestone because arguing with June Whitmore required both confidence and preparedness, and Margaret had apparently developed both. "She's going to be all right," Nathaniel said one evening, watching from Emma's fence line as Margaret drove her cart back toward town. "She was always going to be all right," Emma said. "She just needed someone to stop standing in the way." Nathaniel looked at her. "You've said that before," he said. "It keeps being true," Emma said. He smiled. The Friday supper came and went, and then another, and then another. And what toward looked like resolved itself gradually, and without drama, into what it had always been going to be two people who had learned to build things carefully and were now building something together. He did not move on to the property. They didn't rush toward any formal arrangement. What they had was a daily presence, a shared language of work and decision-making, a growing familiarity with each other's silences. He was there when she needed him and absent when she didn't, and he had finally, after months, learned to read the difference without being told. One evening in June, sitting on the step of the cabin in the long Montana twilight with Clara asleep inside and the oats on the northern acreage standing 4 inches tall and the kitchen garden lush and producing, Nathaniel said, "I'd like to build something on the eastern end of your property." Emma looked at him. "What kind of something?" she said. "A workshop," he said, "for repairs and tools. The kind of space that makes winter work easier." He paused. "And if you were willing, over time, a larger structure adjacent to the cabin. Something that gave you more room for whatever comes next." Emma was quiet for a moment. "Are you asking my permission?" she said. "Yes," he said. "It's your property." She looked at him. "You could have your own land," she said. "Your father's ranch." 3,000 acres. "I know," he said. "Why would you want to build on my 40? He looked at her with an expression that was very simple and very clear. "Because this is where you are," he said. "And because everything I want to build next to what you've already built. Not instead of it. Not," he paused, "next to it." Emma looked at the oats. She thought about the first morning she had stood on this land, the empty grass, the wide sky, the stack of lumber and the canvas shelter, and the absolute, terrifying freedom of having no one to ask. She thought about the woman who had driven the first nail while her hands were shaking. She thought about what it had cost her to become who she was now, and what it would cost to let someone stand that close to it. She thought about what it would cost to keep refusing. "I'll think about it," she said. "Take your time," he said. "I know I can," she said. "That's why I'm able to." He looked at her. Something in his expression went very soft. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly why." The summer ran long and warm, and the oats did what Nathaniel had predicted they would do, which was produce better than Emma's conservative projection had estimated. And she noted this in her ledger with the particular satisfaction of someone whose numbers have been exceeded rather than fallen short. The kitchen garden outperformed itself. The root cellar she had dug in the spring, another notch in the long list of things she had not known she could do until she did them, was full by August. Clara was 6 months old and had developed the habit of watching everything with an intensity that made people laugh and then look away slightly, as if they had been caught at something. She watched the garden grow. She watched her mother work. She watched Nathaniel with the quiet measuring attention of someone filing information away for later use. When Harlan Brooks came to visit in July, she watched him too. Harlan came once a month now, Always on a Tuesday, always for exactly 1 hour, always with his hat in his hands. He and Emma had developed a careful, honest relationship that was nothing like warmth and nothing like hostility. It was the relationship of two people who have looked at each other clearly and decided to try, which is sometimes more durable than affection. He brought Clara a carved wooden horse in July, made it himself, he said, though he said it quickly. The way people say things they are a little embarrassed to have done. Emma turned it over and looked at the work. It was excellent. She looked up. "You didn't buy this," she said. "I said I made it," he said. "You're good," she said. He looked slightly to the side. "I used to make things, before the ranch got large enough to require all my attention." "You should make things again," Emma said. He looked at the horse in Clara's hands. Clara was examining it with full seriousness, running her fingers over the carved mane. "Maybe," Harlan said. He left on the hour the way he always did. Emma closed the door and looked at the horse. She set it on the shelf above the fireplace. It was still there in August. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Wednesday evening, not on a Friday supper, not during a significant occasion, but during an ordinary end-of-day hour when the light was going amber and Nathaniel was fixing the hinge on the upper door she'd been meaning to address for a week, and Emma was sitting on the step nursing Clara and watching him work. She had been watching him work for the better part of a year. She knew his hands now the way she knew her own. Which ones were the thinking movements, the slight pause when he was solving something, the particular set of his shoulders when the solution arrived. She knew the sound of his hammer against different materials. She knew the way he talked to animals and tools and problems, a low continuous murmur that was not quite conversation and not quite thought, but something in between. She knew, without being able to say exactly when she had known it, that she did not want him to stop being in these spaces with her. Not because she needed him, because she wanted him. The difference, she had told June Whitmore, was significant. "You could build the workshop," she said. He paused. He didn't turn around immediately. He set the hinge carefully and turned to look at her. "The workshop," he said. "And the adjacent structure," she said. "If you still want to." He was very still. He said. "I've thought about it," she said. "For 3 months I've thought about it. And I want you to understand that I'm not saying yes because I'm afraid of winter, or because the farm needs more hands, or because Clara needs a father, though all of those things are true in their way." She looked at him steadily. "I'm saying yes because you asked me what I wanted before you did anything, every single time. Because you have never once walked into a room I was in and rearranged the furniture. Because you held the plank when I needed it held and let me drive the nails, and because that is the most truthful thing anyone has ever done for me." He crossed the yard. He sat down on the step beside her. Clara looked at him with her measuring gaze, and he looked back at her with exactly the same expression. And Emma watched them look at each other and felt something close in her chest that had been open for a very long time. "I should tell you something," Nathaniel said. "Tell me," Emma said. "I didn't plan to love you," he said. "That first morning I rode past your land, I was doing what my father asked me to do. I was going to assess the situation and report back and help him get what he wanted." He paused. "And then I saw you on that platform with your block and tackle rigged to 2 trees, 8 months pregnant, checking the level on a frame you'd raised alone, and something." He stopped. Something just shifted, like a joint going into place. Like the feeling when the work is right. Emma looked at him. "I know that feeling," she said. "I know you do," he said. He reached out and she let him take her hand. Not dramatically. Not with ceremony. Just his hand covering hers on the step, warm and still, the way a good joint holds quietly, without drawing attention to itself, because it was built correctly and it knows how to hold. Clara made a sound of satisfaction and grabbed his finger with her free hand. He laughed. Emma laughed too. And the Montana evening went on around them, the grass moving, the creek running, the wide sky doing what it always did, and the cabin stood behind them solid and square, every plank in its place. every joint holding, every wall a record of what Emma Caldwell had survived and decided and built. They married in September, on the land itself, which was Emma's choice and Nathaniel's preference, and nobody else's business. Thomas Aldridge came from Billings. June Whitmore organized the food with her characteristic iron efficiency. Mrs. Sorensen brought Clara a dress she had made herself from good white cotton. Margaret Hale came from her own homestead, which had 4 walls and a partial roof and a look on Margaret's face that Emma recognized from the inside. Harlan Brooks sat in the front row. He did not say much. He was not a man of many words at significant occasions. But when Emma walked out to where Nathaniel was standing, Harlan stood, and he stood straight, and he held his hat at his chest, and when the ceremony was over he came to Emma first and said, simply and directly, "I misjudged you. I won't do it again. You won't." He nodded. He held Clara for a few minutes while Emma talked to people, and Clara tolerated this with her usual measured assessment, and when he handed her back he said, to Clara, specifically, "You've got a good mother. Pay attention." Clara looked at him with the expression that meant she was filing something away. Emma moved through her wedding day the way she moved through everything purposefully, without excess, fully present to each moment as it arrived. She did not feel the way she had imagined brides felt, which was something vague and overwhelmed and soft at the edges. She felt clear. She felt exact. She felt like someone who has just driven the last nail in a project she has been working on for a long time and stepped back to look at the whole shape of it. It was good work. It was exactly what she had planned it to be. And it was hers. The workshop went up that autumn. Nathaniel and Emma building it together the way they had built everything together, she making the decisions, he holding the other end of the plank, both of them driving nails on the sections that required 2 pairs of hands. The adjacent structure, 2 additional rooms attached to the cabin's eastern wall, went up the following spring, when the ground was workable and the season was long enough to finish before winter. Clara watched all of it from her blanket in the yard, and then from a standing position holding the fence rail, and then from a walking position that was more of a determined lurch, and then from a running position that was the absolute joy and terror of a child who has just discovered that legs can carry you faster than you thought. Emma watched her daughter run. She thought about the woman who had arrived on this land with a suitcase and a canvas shelter and a promise to herself. She thought about the first nail. She thought about the level, and the plumb line, and the long Montana summer when she had talked to a baby not yet born about load-bearing posts and the importance of vertical foundations. She thought about Charles Whitman standing in a Red Hollow courthouse with his hat in his hands and nothing useful left to say. She thought about the notebook, which she still kept, which was now on its 4th volume, in which she still wrote every decision and every plan and every calculation that mattered. Because she was still and would always be a woman who made lists and worked the lists and refused to be surprised by what she was capable of. She thought about Nathaniel beside her, his shoulder against hers, watching Clara run in the afternoon light with the particular expression of a man who knows he is exactly where he is supposed to be and intends to stay there. She pressed her hand against the wall of the cabin. Her wall, her work, her choice. Emma Caldwell had arrived on this land with nothing but a hammer, a child in her belly, and the absolute refusal to let anyone decide who she was. She had built a home from the ground up, won her daughter in a courtroom, stood her ground against every man who thought her land or her life was theirs to take, and chosen freely, without fear, on her own terms, the person she wanted standing beside her. Some women are broken by the world. Emma Caldwell was the kind of woman the world could not break because she had already decided, long before anyone tested her, what she was made of, and she had built everything she needed to prove it with her own 2 hands. Ilko vitlai van hukming, ngangon dumvatum dim noid zum kochuin vafaikak kochuin kak. She drove the nail into the wood so hard the hammer slipped and split her palm open. She didn't stop. Blood on the handle. Blood on the beam. 8 months pregnant, alone on 40 acres of empty Montana land, and Emma Caldwell drove the next nail, and the next, and the next because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling. And feeling meant remembering the morning her husband had sat across from her in his leather chair, looked at her swollen belly, and said, with the calm of a man announcing a minor scheduling change, "I've arranged for you to stay with my cousin in St. Louis until this is dealt with. Not, are you all right? Not, what do you need? Not even, I'm sorry, this is dealt with." She had set down her coffee cup, walked upstairs, packed one bag, taken the deed she had filed in secret 3 weeks before, and walked out the front door of the finest house in Denver without looking back once. And now she was here, bleeding, building alone. The town of Red Hollow watched and whispered and waited for her to break. She never did. But what happened next, what that woman built with nothing but her hands and her will on 40 acres of forgotten Montana land, was something nobody in Red Hollow, nobody in Denver, and certainly not her husband, ever saw coming. If you have ever been told you were too much and not enough at the same time, stay with me. This story is for you. Subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Emma Caldwell's story travels, because it deserves to go everywhere.